For 6 months, every single morning without fail, Maeve Carter carried a breakfast bundle through silent streets just as dawn cracked the sky. The ritual had become as steady and necessary as breathing itself, something she did on autopilot, a quiet anchor in a life that often felt shaky. At exactly 6:15 a.m., she waited at the old bus stop on Langston Avenue and 12th Street, a steaming cup of spiced tea in her hand, a warm cheese and egg wrap tucked inside parchment paper, and a small box of sliced fruit nestled in a soft cloth. That was the breakfast she brought each day to the elderly man who slept at that spot. Maeve was 22, black, working 2 exhausting jobs just to keep her tiny apartment and keep the lights on. He was about 68, white, without a home, and weaving stories no one ever took seriously. Then one morning, everything changed. Before the sun was even up and while Maeve was still in her hospital scrubs, exhausted from a double shift, there was a sharp knock at her apartment door. When she opened it, blinking against the early light, she saw 3 military officers in crisp dress uniforms, their shoes polished, their presence commanding. At the front stood a colonel, posture perfect, staring down at her cracked, faded doorstep. Her heart sank. "Miss Carter," the colonel began, voice grave, "we need to speak with you about Mr. Langdon." "The old man from the bus stop?" Maeve's voice wavered. "Is he okay?" The colonel's expression didn't change. "We're here because of what you did for him." Standing there in her doorway at barely 6 in the morning, still wearing yesterday's rumpled scrubs that smelled faintly of antiseptic and exhaustion, Maeve felt the world tilt sideways. The 3 officers stood perfectly still in the dim hallway, their uniforms so pristine they seemed almost unreal against the chipped paint and water-stained ceiling of her apartment building. Behind them, Mrs. Chen from across the hall peeked through her partially open door, eyes wide with curiosity or concern or both. Maeve's mind raced backward through the past 6 months, trying to understand what any of this meant, trying to connect the frail old man who slept on cardboard with these polished symbols of military authority standing on her threshold. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the doorframe, the weight of too many sleepless nights suddenly pressing down on her shoulders like a physical thing she could barely hold up. The colonel, whose name tag read Hayes in sharp black letters, waited patiently for her to process his words. His face was weathered but kind, creased with lines that suggested he'd spent years delivering difficult news to people who didn't want to hear it. Behind him stood 2 younger officers, a woman and a man, both ramrod straight with their hands clasped behind their backs in that universal military posture that Maeve had only ever seen in movies. The woman's eyes flickered with something that might have been sympathy. The man's face remained completely neutral, unreadable as stone. "May we come in, Miss Carter?" Colonel Hayes asked, his tone gentle but leaving little room for refusal. "This conversation requires some privacy, and I think you'll want to sit down for what we need to discuss." Maeve stepped back automatically, her brain still trying to catch up with what was happening. Her apartment was embarrassingly small, a studio that barely qualified as living space, with a kitchenette that consisted of a hot plate and a mini fridge, a bathroom with a shower that only worked if you jiggled the handle just right, and a main room that served as bedroom, living room, and study space all at once. Her mattress sat directly on the floor in one corner, covered with sheets she'd washed in the building's basement laundry room just 2 days ago. A small desk she'd rescued from the curb held her laptop and a stack of textbooks from the community college nursing program she was somehow managing to attend between shifts. Dirty dishes sat in the tiny sink because she'd been too tired to wash them before falling into bed after her last shift. The whole space probably measured 300 square feet on a generous day, and now it was about to hold 4 people, 3 of whom looked like they belonged in places far more impressive than this. The officers filed in with practiced efficiency, somehow making the cramped space feel even smaller just by virtue of their presence and their perfectly pressed uniforms. Colonel Hayes gestured toward the single folding chair Maeve kept near her desk, indicating she should sit. She did, more because her legs suddenly felt unreliable than because she was particularly obedient. The female officer, whose name tag identified her as Lieutenant Rivera, positioned herself near the door. The male officer, Lieutenant Park according to his uniform, stood near the window with his hands still clasped behind his back, looking out at the gray morning sky as though giving Maeve some semblance of privacy for whatever was about to unfold. Colonel Hayes remained standing, pulling a manila folder from under his arm that Maeve hadn't noticed until now. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice filling the small room but somehow not overwhelming it, "how long have you known Thomas Langdon?" The name hit Maeve like cold water. Thomas. She'd been bringing breakfast to that man for half a year and had never known his full name. He'd told her to call him Tom, just Tom, and she'd accepted that without question, the way you accept most things about people living on the street, because you sense that some stories are too heavy to demand in full. 6 months, she heard herself say, her voice sounding distant and strange to her own ears. Maybe a little more. Since late March. She paused, swallowing against the dryness in her throat. Is he all right? Did something happen to him? I haven't seen him in 3 days and I've been worried sick, but I didn't know who to call or where to look, and the shelters wouldn't tell me anything. And Colonel Hayes held up a hand gently, stopping the flood of words that was threatening to spill out of her. "Mr. Langdon is alive," he said, and Maeve felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized had been wound so tight. "He's in stable condition at Veterans Memorial Hospital. He had a cardiac episode 4 days ago. Paramedics found him unconscious near the bus terminal. He's been in intensive care, but he's going to recover." The relief that washed through Maeve was so intense it left her dizzy. For 3 days she'd been imagining the worst, had been walking past that empty corner where his cardboard mat usually sat and feeling a growing dread that something terrible had happened and she'd never know what. She'd asked the shelter workers, had called the non-emergency police line, had even stopped random people on the street asking if they'd seen an older white man with silver hair and a faded green jacket, but no one had any answers. A woman with a small dog stopped to watch, uncomfortable but fascinated. Someone pulled out a phone and started recording. "Stay in your truck," Weatherby ordered Marcus, who'd stepped forward to help. "Unless you'd like me to call your supervisor Rodriguez with a complaint." The threat was clear. One call could mean disciplinary action, suspension, termination. Kofi made it to the truck's lifter, his arms trembling. Marcus activated the hydraulics quickly. 1 down, 5 to go. "See what happens when you actually apply yourself?" Weatherby said. "Maybe if more people like you worked harder instead of relying on shortcuts, you'd get somewhere in life." The second bin was heavier, old books, magazines, stone garden ornaments. Kofi felt something pull in his lower back as he lifted. A warning, but he kept moving. "I was reading about automation," Weatherby continued conversationally. "How robots will replace manual labor. I thought, that's good. Machines don't complain. They just do what they're programmed to do." Kofi's hands began blistering, the rough plastic edges digging into his palms. Blood started seeping through broken skin. Marcus saw it, his face darkening with anger. "Mr. Weatherby, he's injured. Let him use the equipment. A few blisters build character," Weatherby dismissed. "Teach the value of hard work." The third bin contained rancid party food, spoiled sauces, rotting vegetables, swarming fruit flies. Kofi's injured hands screamed as he gripped the rim. 3 steps in, his grip failed. Rotten food spilled across the expensive Italian travertine driveway. "Now you're making a mess," Weatherby exploded. "That driveway cost more than you make in a month. Clean it up. All of it." Kofi knelt on the pristine pavement, his bleeding hands picking through garbage, while Weatherby berated him and strangers recorded his humiliation. And in that moment, something in Kofi went very quiet. Not broken, never broken, but calculating, observing. His mind, sharpened by 6 years of community college night classes in accounting, business law, and financial management, began working on a different level. He noticed Weatherby kept checking his watch, distracted. His hand kept moving to his pocket, reaching for something that wasn't there. Something was off this morning, beyond the need to assert dominance. But first, Kofi had to survive 3 more bins. The 4th bin, filled with construction debris, broken marble, shattered tiles, nearly defeated him. 250 pounds, dangerously heavy for manual lifting. "Problem?" Weatherby asked, arms crossed. The crowd had grown. Multiple phones recorded.
This humiliation would be online by lunchtime. Man, this is insane, Marcus said. You can't expect. I expect him to do his job, Weatherby interrupted. Or I call Rodriguez right now. Kofi thought of Jasmine, of college application fees, of his late wife Sarah, who'd always said, "Hold your head high, Kofi. Your worth isn't determined by what others think." He gripped the bin and lifted. 3 steps. Then his grip failed completely. The bin crashed down, marble chunks spilling across the driveway. One piece skittered across the travertine, leaving a long scratch. "That's IT," Weatherby roared. "You damaged my property. I'm calling the police. You're finished. You'll never work in this city again." He fumbled for his phone, fingers shaking with rage. The phone tumbled from his grasp, bounced once, and slid under his Range Rover. Damn it! Weatherby dropped to his knees, reaching under the vehicle. And in that moment, Kofi's eyes caught something else. Another phone on the ground near an earlier bin. A Samsung Galaxy in a black case. Screen lit up with cascading red notifications. Urgent. Portfolio transfer mismatch warning. Settlement deadline, 9 o'clock alert. Account discrepancy, $8.7 million. Years of studying finance clicked into place. Kofi picked up the phone with his bloody hands and read the email preview. Bradford, critical error in Friday's transfer. You authorized $8.7 million to account number 4429, Development LLC, but wire shows funds going to account #4429B, Legacy Holdings. Development LLC settlement is today 9 a.m. Without funds, you'll default on Riverside property deal and forfeit $12 million earnest money plus breach of contract lawsuit. Been trying to reach you all morning. Call immediately. Kofi's breath caught. A simple transposition error, 4,429 versus 4429B, had sent $8.7 million to the wrong account. Meanwhile, a settlement requiring those exact funds was scheduled for 9 a.m. He glanced at his watch. 8:47 a.m. 13 minutes until default. Every fiber screamed to walk away. Let this cruel man face consequences of his own negligence. It would be justified. But Sarah's voice echoed, "Be the person who does the right thing. Not because people deserve it, but because you deserve to be that person." "Sir," Kofi said. Weatherby didn't respond, still scrambling under the Range Rover. "Sir," Kofi repeated louder. "What?" Weatherby snapped, pulling himself up, white pants smudged with oil. "What do you possibly want now? You have an urgent financial emergency, and you have 12 minutes before you lose $12 million. The words penetrated like ice water. Weatherby went from red to pale in seconds. "What are you talking about? Your portfolio has a critical mismatch. Wire transfer to the wrong account. Your settlement deadline is in 12 minutes. If you don't fix this now, you default on a major property deal and lose millions." Weatherby snatched the phone, his hands shaking as he read Gerald's email. His face went white. "Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God!" 17 missed calls from his financial advisor. 9 from his attorney. 5 from the title company. The phone had been on silent. Must have fallen from his pocket early that morning while he was... What? He couldn't even remember. All he knew was that his empire was 12 minutes from collapse. And the only person who'd noticed was the man he'd spent an hour humiliating. "How did I... when..." Weatherby looked at Kofi, genuine fear in his eyes. "I have 12 minutes. The bank won't be able to... He spiraled into panic, breathing rapid and shallow. Around them, the crowd pressed closer. Marcus moved to Kofi's side. Neighbors exchanged confused glances. Kofi watched this powerful man reduced to helplessness. He could walk away now. He'd pointed out the problem. That was more than Weatherby deserved. But Sarah's voice, "Be the person who does the right thing. Sir, if you're willing to listen, I might be able to help you fix this." Weatherby looked at him, really looked, and saw not a garbage collector but a human being offering a lifeline. You can help. I can try. But we need to move fast. And you need to listen carefully. Bradford Weatherby 3, master of his universe, said the words that would change both their lives. Please, tell me what to do. The crowd fell silent, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Social roles had inverted, the powerful suddenly needed the powerless. Kofi wiped his bloody hands on his pants and shifted into analytical mode, his mind organizing the problem. Assess, identify options, execute solution. First question. Was the wire transfer domestic or international? Weatherby pulled up details with shaking hands. Domestic. Goldman Sachs to Legacy Holdings at Citibank. Good. Domestic transfers can be recalled if we move fast and if the receiving account hasn't confirmed receipt. What time was it initiated? Friday afternoon, 4:47 p.m.
It was just what you do. But even as she said it, Maeve knew that wasn't entirely true. It hadn't been just what you do. Most people didn't do it. Most people walked past Tom and the hundreds of others like him scattered across the city's corners and underpasses and abandoned doorways. Most people had learned to make homeless humans invisible, to edit them out of their field of vision so completely that their absence from consciousness became automatic. Maeve had done it herself for years, had perfected the art of not seeing because seeing meant acknowledging and acknowledging meant feeling something uncomfortable that was easier to avoid. But something about Tom had broken through that carefully constructed blindness. Maybe it was the particular morning light that had made him look especially frail. Maybe it was the fact that she'd been reading about veteran homelessness in one of her classes and the statistics had been rattling around in her head. Maybe it was just timing, the right person in the right place at the right moment of being ready to see what had always been there. Colonel Hayes exchanged glances with the two lieutenants, some wordless communication passing between them that Maeve couldn't interpret. Then he carefully placed the photograph back in the folder and pulled out another document, this one several pages stapled together with official-looking letterhead at the top. Miss Carter, Captain Langdon regained consciousness yesterday afternoon. He's still weak but he's coherent. And the first thing he asked about, before his own prognosis or treatment plan, was whether you were all right. He was worried that you'd been looking for him, worried that you'd been frightened by his absence. Colonel Hayes's expression softened slightly. He also asked us to give you this. He held out an envelope, standard white, with her name written on the front in shaky handwriting she recognized from the few notes Tom had left her over the months, little thank you messages tucked into the cloth she used to wrap the fruit, small observations about the weather or the birds. Maeve took it with trembling fingers, the paper feeling impossibly heavy in her hands. She looked at Colonel Hayes questioningly, and he nodded, giving her permission to open it in front of them. The seal tore easily, and inside was a single sheet of notebook paper covered in that same unsteady script. She began to read, and the words blurred almost immediately because her eyes were filling with tears she'd been holding back since the moment she'd opened her door and seen these uniforms standing in her hallway. The letter was short, just a few paragraphs, but every word felt weighted with meaning. Tom wrote that he was sorry for worrying her, sorry for disappearing without warning, sorry that she'd had to advocate for him when he should have been able to advocate for himself. He thanked her for the breakfasts, for the conversation, for treating him like a human being when the world had decided he was something less than that. He wrote that their morning meetings had been the only thing keeping him tethered to hope during a period when he'd been close to giving up entirely. And then, in the final paragraph, he wrote something that made Maeve's breath catch in her throat. You reminded me that I still matter, that my life still has worth even in circumstances I never imagined for myself. You saw me when I was invisible. That's a gift I can never repay, but I'm trying. These officers will explain. Please hear them out. You deserve recognition for an act of kindness that was also an act of profound courage. Thank you for every morning, every conversation, every small grace you offered without being asked. You changed my life, Maeve. You saved it in more ways than one. With deepest gratitude, Tom. Maeve folded the letter carefully and looked up at Colonel Hayes through eyes that were definitely crying now, tears tracking down her cheeks that she didn't bother to wipe away. What does he mean? She asked. About recognition? The colonel gestured to Lieutenant Park, who finally turned from the window and pulled out his own folder, this one thicker than the first. When he opened it, Maeve could see more photographs, documents with official stamps, what looked like medical records and service commendations. "Miss Carter," Lieutenant Park said, his voice precise and formal, "Captain Langdon's case has become a matter of interest at the highest levels of the Department of Veterans Affairs. His story, particularly the circumstances of how he fell through the system and how you personally ensured he received care, has triggered a comprehensive review of how we process and support veterans with complex service histories." He pulled out one of the documents, holding it so she could see the seal at the top, which she recognized from news broadcasts as belonging to some important government office she couldn't immediately name. The VA Inspector General's office is conducting a full audit of similar cases. Captain Langdon's medical records have been reconstructed. His benefits have been reinstated retroactively with full back payment. His disability rating has been adjusted to accurately reflect his service-connected conditions. And a task force has been assembled to identify and assist other veterans who've been failed by administrative oversights. He paused, and Maeve saw something like respect in his expression. None of that would have happened if you hadn't insisted someone check the system that day in the hospital. You didn't just help one man, Miss Carter. You potentially helped thousands. The words felt impossible, too large to fit inside the cramped space of her studio apartment with its water-stained ceiling and its hot plate kitchen. Maeve shook her head slowly, trying to process what she was being told, trying to reconcile the simple act of bringing breakfast to a lonely old man with this cascade of institutional change and official recognition. "I don't understand," she said. "I didn't do anything special. I just made them look him up. That's basic human decency, not some kind of heroic intervention." But even as she said it, she remembered the nurse's initial resistance, the way the attending physician had seemed annoyed at the interruption, how the social worker had actually rolled her eyes when Maeve had insisted Tom was a veteran. She remembered having to stand her ground, having to refuse to leave, having to insist 3 separate times that they check the VA database before someone had finally, grudgingly, entered his name into the system. And she remembered the shocked silence that had followed when the results came back, when screens full of service records and classified notations had appeared, when suddenly this nameless homeless man had become someone who mattered in the official calculus of worthiness. "That's exactly what makes it special," Lieutenant Rivera said gently. "Basic human decency is rare, Miss Carter. Especially directed toward people society has decided don't deserve it. You didn't know Captain Langdon had a distinguished service record when you started helping him. You didn't know he'd saved lives or earned medals or served in classified operations. You helped him because he was a human being who needed help. That's the definition of compassion without agenda, kindness without calculation. That's what the system is supposed to provide and almost never does. And that's why what you did matters so much." She smiled slightly. "You showed us what we're supposed to be." Colonel Hayes cleared his throat, drawing Maeve's attention back to him. "There's more, Miss Carter. Captain Langdon has specifically requested that you be present at a ceremony being planned at Veterans Memorial Hospital next month. The VA secretary will be there, along with several high-ranking officials. They want to publicly acknowledge the systemic failures that led to his homelessness and announce the reforms being implemented to prevent similar cases. And Captain Langdon wants you there as his guest, to be recognized for your role in his recovery and in triggering these changes." He studied her carefully. "You don't have to attend if you're not comfortable with public attention. But I'm authorized to tell you that the VA would also like to discuss a potential position with you, working as an advocate and liaison for homeless veterans. Your combination of medical training, personal experience, and demonstrated commitment makes you an ideal candidate." The room seemed to spin slightly. A ceremony. The VA secretary. A job offer. It was too much, too fast, too far removed from her reality of double shifts and community college classes and checking her bank account 3 times before buying groceries. Maeve opened her mouth to say something but found she couldn't form words. She looked down at Tom's letter still clutched in her hands, at his shaky handwriting spelling out gratitude for something that had felt so small and simple in the moment. She thought about all those mornings standing at the bus stop in the pre-dawn cold, the steam rising from the tea, the way Tom's face would brighten when he saw her approaching, how they developed a comfortable rhythm of greeting and conversation that had become one of the few reliable things in her chaotic life. She thought about the morning she'd arrived to find him gone, that empty spot where his cardboard mat usually lay, the rising panic she'd felt over the following days as she searched for him without success. She thought about standing in that hospital hallway, exhausted and scared, refusing to let them transfer him to county until someone checked if he had benefits that could pay for proper care. "Why me?" she finally managed to ask, looking up at Colonel Hayes. "There are thousands of people who work with homeless populations. Social workers and counselors and people with actual training and degrees. I'm just a dietary aide who brought someone breakfast. Why would anyone want me in an official capacity?" The colonel's expression softened in a way that made him look less like a military officer and more like someone's kind father. Because you didn't need training or credentials to see someone who needed help and help them. Because you sacrificed time and money you didn't have to spare for someone you had no obligation to care about. Because when the system tried to brush aside another invisible veteran, you stood in the way and demanded they look. He gestured around her tiny apartment, taking in the worn furniture and the precarious stacks of textbooks and the general atmosphere of someone barely scraping by. "You're working 2 jobs and putting yourself through school. You don't have resources to spare. And yet you spared them anyway, consistently, for months. That's not training, Miss Carter. That's character. And character is exactly what the VA needs more of." Lieutenant Park added, "The position would come with full benefits, including coverage for you to complete your nursing degree. The salary would be more than you're currently making at both your jobs combined. And the work would involve outreach, advocacy, and program development focused on ensuring no veteran falls through the cracks the way Captain Langdon did. You'd be helping to build the system we should have had all along." He paused. "It's not charity. You'd be earning every cent and working harder than you probably have in your life. But you'd also be making a difference that matters, using your experience to help people who desperately need someone who understands what they're facing." Maeve felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. For 2 years she'd been grinding through life one exhausted day at a time, trying to keep her head above water while pursuing a nursing degree that felt like it was always just slightly out of reach. She'd been so focused on surviving, on making rent and avoiding eviction and somehow accumulating enough credits to graduate, that she'd stopped thinking about what might come after. The idea that her morning ritual with Tom, her simple act of bringing him breakfast and refusing to let him die invisible and nameless, could somehow transform into meaningful work that actually paid enough to live on seemed almost too good to be true. But looking at these 3 officers standing in her apartment with their official folders and their serious expressions, Maeve realized they weren't offering her charity or pity. They were offering her a chance to turn a moving personal experience into something systemic, to help others the way she'd helped Tom, to be part of fixing a broken system instead of just witnessing its casualties. "Can I think about it?" she asked quietly. "The job, I want to say yes, but I need to understand what I'd be committing to, and I need to talk to Tom first, make sure he's actually okay with all this attention being drawn to his story." Colonel nodded. "Of course, this isn't a decision to make lightly, and you're right to want more information. We'll arrange for you to visit Captain Langdon at the hospital, assuming you're willing. He's asking to see you, and I think talking with him directly would help you understand what his recovery has meant and what role you played in making it possible." He handed her a business card with phone numbers and email addresses printed in clean block letters. "Take a few days. Talk to Captain Langdon. Research the position. And then let us know. The offer will stand regardless of your decision about the ceremony, though we hope you'll attend that as well. What you did deserves recognition, whether you're comfortable with it or not." The 3 officers prepared to leave, moving with that same practiced efficiency they'd shown arriving, somehow managing to navigate the cramped space without bumping into her meager furniture or knocking over the precarious stacks of textbooks. Lieutenant Rivera paused at the door, turning back with something gentle in her expression. "Miss Carter, I grew up in a neighborhood where we saw homeless veterans on every corner. We walked past them every day. And I walked past them too for years without really seeing them. It took me joining the military and serving alongside people who I later realized could become those same invisible figures to understand that homelessness isn't a moral failure, it's a systemic failure. You understood that without having to serve, without needing that first-hand experience. That makes you wiser than most of us who wear uniforms. Don't underestimate the value of that wisdom. After they left, Maeve stood in the center of her apartment for a long time, holding Tom's letter and the colonel's business card, staring at the door they'd closed behind them as though she could still see their pressed uniforms and polished shoes. The morning light was fully up now, gray and soft through her single window that looked out over an alley filled with dumpsters and fire escapes. She should have been sleeping after her double shift. She should have been exhausted, collapsing into bed fully clothed and not waking until her alarm screamed that it was time for her next shift. But instead she was wide awake, her mind racing through everything that had just happened, everything that might happen, all the ways her carefully managed routine of survival might be about to transform into something she couldn't quite envision yet. She thought about Tom lying in a hospital bed, recovering from a cardiac episode that could have killed him if he'd been left unconscious on that street corner for a few more hours. She thought about him waking up and asking about her before asking about his own condition, worried that she'd been frightened by his disappearance. She thought about him writing that letter in his shaky handwriting, trying to express gratitude for something he shouldn't have had to be grateful for because it should have been the baseline standard of how people treat each other. And she thought about the photograph Colonel Hayes had shown her, that younger Tom in his pristine uniform with all those medals across his chest, looking like someone who commanded respect and authority, someone the system was supposed to remember and honor and care for. The distance between that photograph and the frail old man sleeping on cardboard felt impossible to comprehend, a gulf created by bureaucratic indifference and administrative failure and a society that had gotten very good at deciding which people mattered and which ones didn't. Maeve looked down at the business card in her hand, at the official seal and the phone numbers and the title printed below Colonel Hayes's name. Department of Veterans Affairs, Office of the Inspector General, Special Investigations Division. This was real. This was happening. Her simple act of bringing breakfast to a lonely old man, her insistence that hospital staff check whether he had benefits, her refusal to let Tom die nameless and invisible, had somehow cascaded into an investigation and policy reforms and a job offer and public recognition. It felt surreal, like she'd stepped through some kind of portal from her ordinary struggling life into a story that happened to other people, fictional people in movies or inspiring news segments, not to a 22-year-old dietary aide barely keeping her head above water. She made herself coffee using her ancient coffee maker that sputtered and hissed but eventually produced something drinkable. She sat on her mattress on the floor with her back against the wall, sipping the bitter brew and reading Tom's letter over and over until she'd memorized every word. "You reminded me that I still matter," he'd written. Such a simple statement. Such a devastating indictment of what his life had become that a simple reminder of basic human worth was notable enough to merit written thanks. Maeve thought about all the mornings she'd handed him the wrapped breakfast and the tea, how his hands would shake slightly as he accepted them, how he'd always say thank you with a dignity that suggested he remembered being someone to whom people said thank you, someone whose presence and opinions and contributions mattered in the wider world. She thought about how they'd talk about small things, about weather and birds and the particular quality of early morning light, conversations that asked nothing of each other except mutual recognition of shared humanity. She thought too about all the people who'd walked past him without seeing him, all the days and weeks and months when he'd been invisible to everyone except her. How many others were out there right now, sleeping on cardboards in doorways and under overpasses, with service records and sacrifices and whole lives that had been edited out of collective consciousness? How many had families who'd given up on them, systems that had lost their paperwork, benefits that had been denied on technicalities, dignity that had been stripped away piece by piece until they'd become ghosts haunting the city's margins? Tom had been one of the lucky ones, impossibly lucky really, because Maeve had happened to walk past his corner every morning, because she'd happened to pack an extra sandwich that first day, because something in his eyes had broken through her carefully cultivated blindness. But what about all the others who weren't lucky, who didn't happen to cross paths with someone stubborn enough to insist they mattered? The thought of the job offer came back to her, the possibility of turning her personal experience into something systemic, something that might help more than just one forgotten veteran. Lieutenant Park had said she'd be developing outreach programs and advocacy initiatives, working to ensure no one fell through the cracks the way Tom had. It sounded impossibly ambitious, The kind of work that surely required advanced degrees and years of experience and connections she didn't have. But Colonel Hayes had said what they needed was character, not credentials. He'd said her willingness to help when she had nothing to spare demonstrated exactly the qualities the system needed. Maeve wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that her morning ritual had meaning beyond the personal, that her stubborn insistence on Tom's worth could translate into broader change. But she also felt the weight of imposter syndrome pressing down, the voice in her head insisting she wasn't qualified, wasn't educated enough, wasn't professional enough to work in official capacities alongside people with titles and expertise. She finished her coffee and made herself get up, moving through her tiny apartment with renewed purpose. She needed to see Tom, needed to talk to him directly, to understand what he wanted from all this, to make sure he was truly recovering and not just being paraded out for some publicity campaign that would use his story without actually caring about his ongoing welfare. Colonel Hayes had given her permission to visit, had even suggested they could arrange transportation if she needed it, but Maeve decided to go on her own, to make the trip to Veterans Memorial Hospital during what would normally be her sleep time because this felt too important to delay. She changed out of her wrinkled scrubs into clean jeans and a simple sweater, washed her face, pulled her hair back into a neat bun. Looking at herself in the small mirror above her bathroom sink, she saw the exhaustion etched into her features, the dark circles under her eyes that had become permanent fixtures, the thinness of her face that came from too many skipped meals. She looked like what she was, someone barely keeping it together. But she also saw something else now, something she hadn't noticed before or maybe hadn't let herself notice. She saw determination. She saw someone who'd chosen kindness when it cost her something. She saw someone who mattered, who'd made a difference, who'd changed the trajectory of another human being's life simply by refusing to look away. The bus ride to Veterans Memorial Hospital took 45 minutes, winding through neighborhoods that gradually shifted from her working-poor area to more middle-class streets to the medical district with its cluster of large buildings and parking structures. Maeve sat near the back, watching the city flow past the windows, thinking about all the times she'd ridden this route without really seeing it, her mind occupied with exhaustion or worry or the endless mental calculations of how to stretch money further than it wanted to stretch. Today everything looked sharper somehow, more present, as though the conversation with the officers had pulled her more fully into consciousness. She saw other tired people on the bus, workers heading to morning shifts like she usually would be, students with backpacks clutching coffee cups, elderly folks with careful expressions making their way to medical appointments. She wondered how many of them had their own versions of Tom in their lives, people they passed every day without seeing, opportunities for connection and compassion they walked past because it was easier not to engage. At the hospital she stopped first at the information desk, explaining that she was there to visit Thomas Langdon, expecting complications or restrictions or the usual bureaucratic runaround. But the volunteer at the desk, an older woman with kind eyes and a name tag reading Doris, lit up with recognition at Tom's name. "Oh, Captain Langdon," she said warmly. "Yes, he's in room 412. They moved him out of ICU yesterday. Such a lovely man." She printed out a visitor badge and handed it to Maeve with a smile that felt genuine. "He's been asking about a young woman who brings him breakfast. I suspect that's you?" Maeve nodded, suddenly nervous in a way she hadn't expected. "He's recovering well," Doris continued. "You should have seen the stream of officials going up there yesterday. Quite a commotion. But he seemed most interested in knowing if you'd been notified he was here." She pointed toward the elevators. "4th floor, turn right, room 412. Visiting hours are technically restricted, but I'll note that you have special permission from the Inspector General's office." The elevator ride felt endless, the metal box rising slowly while Maeve's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd seen Tom in the ICU that first day, unconscious and vulnerable behind glass, but this would be different. This would be him awake and aware, knowing what she'd done and maybe grateful in ways that would make her uncomfortable because she still couldn't accept that she'd done anything extraordinary. The 4th floor hallway was quiet, afternoon shift nurses moving between rooms with practiced efficiency, the smell of antiseptic and institutional meals hanging in the air. Room 412 was near the end, the door partially open. Maeve paused outside it, suddenly uncertain, then forced herself to knock gently on the doorframe. "Come in," came Tom's voice, weaker than she remembered but recognizably his, and she pushed the door open and stepped inside. Tom was sitting up in bed, propped against pillows that made him look smaller than he was, wearing a hospital gown and with an 4-line running into his arm. But his eyes were clear and alert, and when he saw her standing in the doorway, his whole face transformed with joy that was so pure and unguarded it made Maeve's throat tight. "Maeve," he said, and even his weak voice carried warmth. "Came. I was worried they wouldn't be able to reach you, or that you'd be too angry with me for disappearing." She crossed the room quickly, pulling the visitor chair close to his bed and sitting down before her shaky legs could betray her. "Angry?" she repeated. "Tom, I've been terrified. You vanished and I had no way to find you, and I thought something awful had happened and I'd never know what." Her voice broke slightly. "Don't ever do that to me again." He reached out with his free hand, the one without the 4, and she took it carefully, struck by how frail his fingers felt in hers, how the skin was papery and thin and marked with bruises from where nurses had drawn blood or adjusted lines. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "The cardiac event happened fast. One moment I was sitting at the usual spot, the next I was waking up in intensive care with people asking me questions I couldn't answer. By the time I understood where I was and what had happened, several days had passed." He squeezed her hand gently. "But you found me anyway. Made them look me up. Made sure I got proper care instead of being shipped off to county where I'd have been just another number, another forgotten person waiting to die in a hallway." His eyes glistened with moisture. "You saved my life, Maeve. In every way that matters." "I just made them check the VA system," Maeve protested, uncomfortable with the weight of his gratitude. Any decent person would have done the same. But Tom shook his head slowly. "No, they wouldn't have. Most people wouldn't have known to check. Most people wouldn't have insisted when the staff resisted. Most people would have accepted the initial answer and moved on with their day. But you didn't. You stood there and refused to leave until someone actually looked." He smiled faintly. "The nurse told me about it later. Said you were like a bulldog, polite but absolutely immovable. She said you told them I mattered, that I deserved proper care regardless of what I could pay, that checking the VA database was the least they could do. You advocated for someone you owed nothing to. That's not common decency, Maeve. That's exceptional compassion." They sat in silence for a moment, hands clasped, the hospital room quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors tracking Tom's vital signs. Maeve looked at him, really looked, taking in the changes recovery was already bringing to his appearance. He was clean, his hair washed and combed back from his face. Someone had trimmed his beard. The hospital gown was crisp and white. But more than the physical changes, there was something different in his bearing, a subtle shift back toward the man in that photograph Colonel Hayes had shown her, the decorated captain who'd commanded respect and authority. It was like watching someone slowly remember who they used to be, identity reasserting itself now that basic needs were being met and dignity was being restored. "The officers came to see me this morning," Maeve said. "Colonel Hayes and 2 lieutenants. They told me about your service record, about how you fell through the cracks, about the investigation and the reforms. Tom, why didn't you tell me you were a veteran? Why didn't you say you had benefits you couldn't access?" He sighed, looking away toward the window where afternoon light filtered through half-closed blinds. Pride maybe, or shame, or just exhaustion from fighting systems that seemed designed to defeat people like me. "I tried in the beginning, after I lost my housing and ended up on the streets. I went to the VA, stood in lines, filled out forms, talked to counselors who promised to help. But my records were lost or misfiled or somehow corrupted. My benefits applications kept getting denied for reasons nobody could adequately explain. After the 3rd or 4th denial, I just gave up. It seemed easier to accept homelessness than to keep fighting bureaucracy that clearly didn't want me to win." He turned back to face her, and she saw shame in his expression, the particular shame of someone who'd once been capable and self-sufficient confronting their own vulnerability. "And by the time I met you, I'd been homeless for so long that part of me had started to believe I deserved it. That maybe the system was right to forget me, that maybe I'd failed some fundamental test of adaptability or resilience." The stories I told you about my service and the missions and the places I'd been, they felt less real to me every day. Like maybe I'd imagined them, or maybe they'd happened to someone else, someone I used to be but couldn't access anymore. He squeezed her hand again. But you never treated me like I'd failed. You never looked at me with pity or disgust. You just brought breakfast every morning and talked to me like I was a person whose conversation had value. You reminded me that I was still here, still capable of connection, still worthy of basic kindness. That kept me alive, not just physically but in every way that makes life worth living. Maeve felt tears tracking down her face and didn't bother wiping them away. She thought about all those mornings, the routine that had become so automatic she sometimes did it on autopilot, barely conscious of the significance beyond the simple exchange of food and conversation. She thought about how small it had seemed in the moment, how she'd never imagined that making a sandwich and brewing tea and walking 4 blocks could mean the difference between someone giving up and someone holding on. "You matter, Tom," she said fiercely. "You always mattered. The system failed you, but that doesn't mean you failed. You served your country with distinction. You deserve every benefit you earned. And you deserve to be seen and valued regardless of where you sleep or what you own or whether bureaucrats can keep their paperwork straight." "I know that now," Tom said softly, "because you showed me, and because you insisted that others see it too." He shifted slightly in the bed, wincing as the movement pulled against his foreline. "They want to do a ceremony. Public recognition of systemic failure and announcement of reforms. The VA secretary will be there. They want you there too, being honored for advocating on my behalf." He watched her face carefully. "I told them I wouldn't participate unless you were comfortable with it. This is your decision, Maeve. If you don't want the attention, if you want to keep your privacy and your anonymity, I'll tell them the ceremony can't happen. My story doesn't matter if it comes at the cost of your comfort." Maeve considered this, turning it over in her mind from multiple angles. Part of her wanted to refuse, to retreat back into her quiet life of double shifts and community college classes, to avoid the attention and scrutiny that public recognition would inevitably bring. But another part of her, the part that had been awakened by the conversation with Colonel Hayes, understood that visibility might serve a purpose beyond her own discomfort. If her story could highlight the failures that led to Tom's homelessness, if it could help trigger reforms that would help other forgotten veterans, then maybe her discomfort was a price worth paying. "They offered me a job," she said instead of answering directly. "Working as an advocate and liaison for homeless veterans. Developing outreach programs and ensuring people don't fall through the cracks. It would pay enough that I could quit both my current jobs and finish my nursing degree with actual benefits and support." Tom's face brightened with genuine happiness. "That's wonderful, Maeve. That's perfect for you. You'd be brilliant at it." Then his expression shifted to concern. "But you don't sound entirely certain. What's holding you back?" Maeve laughed shakily. "What's holding me back? Tom, I'm 22 years old with half a nursing degree and experience scraping plates in a hospital cafeteria. I don't have credentials or expertise or any of the things that qualify someone for that kind of position. I'm afraid I'll say yes and then completely fail, or worse, that I'll be some kind of token hire meant to make the VA look good without actually having any real impact." "Listen to me carefully," Tom said, his weak voice gaining strength through intensity. "I've worked with career bureaucrats and policy experts and people with advanced degrees and decades of experience. And you know what most of them lacked? The willingness to actually see the people they were supposed to be serving. The willingness to stand up and insist that someone invisible mattered enough to deserve attention. You have something more valuable than credentials, Maeve. You have heart. You have the ability to look at suffering and respond with compassion instead of indifference. And you have the stubborn determination to refuse convenient answers when you know they're wrong. That's worth more than any degree." He paused, gathering breath. "The system needs people like you. Not to replace experts but to keep them honest, to remind them that policies affect real human beings, to ensure that compassion doesn't get buried under procedure. You'd bring perspective that's desperately needed. And if you're worried about failing, remember that you already succeeded in the most important way. You helped someone who needed help. Everything else builds from that foundation." Maeve sat with his words, feeling some of her anxiety beginning to ease. Maybe he was right. Maybe the point wasn't to have all the answers but to bring authentic caring to a system that too often operated without it. Maybe her inexperience was actually a strength, allowing her to see with fresh eyes what veterans needed rather than being trapped in institutional thinking about what procedures allowed. "The ceremony," she said finally, "if I agree to attend, to be publicly recognized, it's not about me wanting attention. It's because I want people to understand how many others like you are out there, invisible and forgotten, waiting for someone to insist they matter. If my story can highlight that, can help trigger real change instead of just empty promises, then I'll do it. But only if you're comfortable with your story being told, with people knowing what you've been through." Tom nodded slowly. "I'm comfortable with it. Not because I want pity, but because maybe my experience can serve as a catalyst for helping others. If my homelessness and my cardiac event and your intervention can lead to systemic reforms, then something good comes from all that suffering. That feels meaningful in a way nothing else has for a very long time." They talked for another hour about practical things like Tom's treatment plan and where he'd go after discharge from the hospital, about the job offer and what accepting it might mean for Maeve's life trajectory, about the ceremony and what it would involve. The VA had secured temporary housing for Tom at a veterans transitional facility, a clean apartment with support services while he continued cardiac rehabilitation and addressed his PTSD with proper therapy. His benefits were being processed with back payment that would give him financial stability for the first time in years. There was talk of connecting him with a program that helped veterans transition into meaningful work, utilizing his experience in ways that hadn't seemed possible when he was sleeping on cardboard. The transformation from forgotten homeless man to recognized veteran receiving comprehensive support felt almost surreally fast, compressing what should have been months or years of bureaucratic process into mere weeks because his case had become politically important. When visiting hours ended and nurses gently but firmly indicated Maeve needed to leave, Tom held her hand one more time and looked directly into her eyes. "Whatever you decide about the job, about the ceremony, about any of this, I want you to know something. Tell them Charisse from the Langston Avenue stop needs immediate benefits review and housing assistance. I'll personally make sure it gets prioritized." Charisse looked at the card like it might disappear, like trusting this offer might be another setup for disappointment. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You don't know me." Maeve smiled, thinking about Tom and breakfast and the moment she decided to stop walking past invisible people. "Because someone taught me that everyone matters, that service means something, that we're all connected whether we acknowledge it or not. And because refusing to look away when someone needs help is the only thing that actually changes anything." She stood up, preparing to head to her office. "Call me today, Charisse. Let's get you off this corner and into somewhere safe." As she walked away, Maeve heard Charisse call after her, "Thank you," and she turned back to say what Tom had taught her was the only appropriate response to gratitude for basic human decency: "You matter. That's all. You matter, and I'm glad I can help." The story of Maeve Carter bringing breakfast to a homeless veteran and triggering systemic reforms became something of a legend within VA circles, referenced in trainings and policy discussions as an example of how individual compassion could catalyze institutional change. But for Maeve herself, the real story wasn't about ceremony or recognition or even the job that had transformed her life. The real story was simpler and more profound. That seeing another person's humanity and responding with kindness was never wasted, that small acts accumulated into movements, that one breakfast shared consistently over months could save lives and expose failures and remind everyone involved that they were still human beings capable of connection despite systems designed to isolate and erase. She carried that understanding into every day of her work, into every case she reviewed and every veteran she met, remembering always that behind every file was a person who deserved to be seen, whose story mattered, whose life had value regardless of visible circumstances. Tom lived to see the full implementation of the reforms his case had triggered, watched as hundreds of veterans were reconnected with benefits and support through improved tracking and outreach. He published a memoir about his experiences, profits going to fund expanded services for homeless veterans. He spoke at conferences and training sessions, lending his voice to advocacy efforts. And he maintained his friendship with Maeve, meeting her regularly for breakfast at a small cafe near her office. Conversations now happening over proper tables instead of cardboard mats, but carrying the same quality of mutual recognition and respect that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. On the morning of his 70th birthday, sitting across from Maeve with coffee and pastries between them, Tom raised his cup in a small toast. "To the young woman who refused to let me disappear," he said. "To every morning you showed up when you had every reason not to. To the kindness that saved my life and changed countless others. Thank you, Maeve Carter, for seeing me." She raised her own cup, tears pricking her eyes the way they always did when he thanked her for something that still felt so basic it shouldn't require thanks. "To you, Tom Langdon, for reminding me why any of this matters. For showing me that dignity survives impossible circumstances. For teaching me that seeing people isn't radical, it's just right. Thank you for letting me be part of your story." And in that moment, sitting in a comfortable cafe far removed from the cold street corner where they'd first connected, both of them understood something fundamental about human existence. That we are all dependent on each other's willingness to see and acknowledge and care. That systems only work when humans within them remember their humanity. That every person holding a cup of coffee or sleeping on cardboard or walking past without looking is someone's whole universe, complex and valuable, and deserving of recognition. The story that had started with one breakfast offered in compassion had expanded into something larger, but at its core it remained simple. See people, help when you can, refuse to accept invisibility as inevitable, and trust that small acts of kindness accumulate into movements that change everything. That was the lesson Maeve carried forward. The gift Tom had given her by accepting her help and showing her what was possible when you insisted that everyone mattered. It was a lesson she'd spend the rest of her life honoring, one breakfast, one connection, one moment of recognition at a time, building a world where no one had to be invisible ever again.